today we're focused on leading through discrimination because, again, the culture has erupted. There's a lot of things going on the outside, but the reality is it will affect the inside, and people are going to show up to your organizations that might be affected. As a military member, this is something that I see and conversations happen behind the scenes that is affecting a lot of the airmen. I'm in the United States Air Force. There was even an article that came out recently that talked about how military members, African American military members, are typically disciplined a lot more frequently than those of other racial groups. So again, this thing is in fact affecting a lot of businesses, a lot of organizations, even in a space where you protect and serve, even in a space where you gave an oath to serve your country, you still have spaces where discriminatory behavior, or maybe things that a leader might not even be aware of, which we're going to go over, that might be affecting how a specific demographic, racial group is being disciplined or addressed or supported versus others. So again, the goal is to give you those tools to really help you through that season. So let's talk about let's define what diversity, inclusion, and equity is, because we want to aim in our organizations, in our businesses, to have all three of these things. So what is diversity? Diversity are those external features, those things that we can see typically. So these are those protected areas such as race, age, gender, sexual orientation. And the goal is to have workspaces that mimic how society looks. Remember, this is workspaces that mimics how society looks. Yes, we know that in certain organizations, like within the military, I mean, I think we range about 14 to 17% of, African American communities, or that racial group within the military. But then if you could think about, people from Pacific Islanders, that's even less. So you have a lot of organizations or businesses, or even within the military force, where you see that diversity, but again, sometimes you might see less than the others. But the goal when you think about diversity is, again, those external features, those things like race, age, gender, sexual orientation. But again, the goal is to have workspaces where diversity is something that is embraced. And the goal is to have a space that mimics how society looks on the outside. The next thing is inclusion. What is inclusion? That now is the behaviors in the workspace. All are treated fairly and are accepted. Again, this is where now the behaviors within that workspace are now showing that all are treated fairly as well as they are accepted, okay? And then the last part, which I think is one of the most important ones as well, is equity. Equity is allowing people from different backgrounds, from all these individuals, this diverse population, to have access to opportunities and resources. Okay, I've been providing statistics and data over time where you see that maybe women within an organization, they're not having access to opportunities like men are. Or you might have this specific racial group that doesn't have as many opportunities as others. So we want to make sure that we are embedding within our workspaces, within our businesses, this mindset and this code of conduct that really pushes diversity, making sure those areas are protected in race, age, gender, sexual orientation. It mimics what society looks like. Having that inclusion, the behaviors in that workspace also show that everyone is going to be treated fairly and are accepted. And the third thing is that equal access, that everyone has access and they're aware of the opportunities that they have and they have access to those resources. So ask yourself, if you're an organization, if you're a business owner, a lot of small business owners might not have a human resources department, but is this something that you've embedded in your code of ethics? Is this something that you've embedded in everything that you do to ensure that you do, if you have all these areas covered, where you are making sure diversity is covered, inclusion, as well as equity? So think on those things and make sure you're embedding that in the culture of your businesses and organizations. All right, so let's look at some data. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission highlights that there are 100,000 cases closed each year in relation to discrimination all overall. But specifically, racial discrimination is actually the most filed one. However, only 15% of cases are actually relieved. There's some type of relief that happens. Now, again, of course, there's an investigation portion. There's so many layers to ensure that this is a valid complaint and so on. But this is the one that's most filed, but only 15% are relieved. So it's really important that, again, we can't necessarily affect change everywhere within external, organizations, but within our organization, if you are in a leadership role, you really have to pay attention to how you're addressing. How is the investigation process? Is it truly effective where it's really addressing all the areas. And if there is maybe racial discrimination is the highest, how as leaders are we making sure that we have an effective process to ensure that these cases are relieved effectively and we're at 100% or at least within the 90% percentile? So that is the data that that is out there in the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to show how many cases are out there. But again, racial discrimination is the most filed. So have you checked the pulse of your organization, depending on if maybe you're at the CEO level, maybe if you're the second or mid-tier leader, maybe the first tier leader, you might not have as much access to this information, or you might have limited access depending on the level of leadership you're in. But just making sure that you are ensuring the climate, that you're aware of what's going on within your organization, within your teams, and within your businesses. Now, how are you affected? You might be wondering, like, how does this affect me? The reality is, even if you don't have any cases within your organization or your businesses, think about it from this aspect. You could be, unfortunately, a leader that might engage in discriminatory behavior. And I'll show you how self-awareness is so important and how unconscious bias can lead to potential discriminatory behavior. But it could be a leader that, unfortunately, is it exuding, or excuse me, a leader that might be engaging in activities that might be discriminatory. Also, a team member could be an offender. So you might have a team member that is a team member that is an offender, because we saw cases, we heard stories of people being approached in the park. We heard stories of people being approached when they're going to work out, and you have these team members that might work for your company or your business that are unfortunately on the outside, their behaviors are exuding, something maybe that's discriminatory, that might be some racism, and then identifying how you're going to address that. Because even with the woman that was at the park and how her organization, her company actually fired her because they're like, we do not stand and we do not allow anything discriminatory to happen in our doors, and we won't have anybody on our team that does that. And also, your team member could be the person that gets offended. They could be the person that is being victimized. So that's how you can be connected to it. Or this could be something that happened to their family member or their community member. We have to realize that there are certain communities, like the African American community. You have certain communities that are affected differently than others. You have, the indigenous people. You have so many different other pockets of communities that go through different experiences that might not relate to your experience, that might be affected by what's going on the outside. So although you might not feel that within your doors, you're seeing this behavior, you guys are fine. Remember, you could be the leader that might be engaged in this behavior. You could have a team member that's offended. You could have a team member that's the offended or the offender. And then you could have a member that's attached because of the community that they're connected to, because they're seeing this stuff happen on a regular basis. So again, you might have to address it in different spaces, but these are multiple ways that you could be connected, even if you might not be directly the person being dealing with the discriminatory behavior. It could be a team member. It could be a leader that you manage. So really pay attention to all those different things right there. All right. So how can we start this process of leading, having that influence of change? Well, there's a 4-step process that I want you guys to consider. There's a level of self-awareness. There's a awareness that we need to have as leaders to make sure that we don't have biases and it's not showing up in how we're leading. There's a level of empathy that you need to embed. That's why leadership development is so important, because these are things that you need to consider and think about, because you never know where you might face a situation. It's also in team culture and organizational culture and making those changes within that. So the first area we're going to look at is self-awareness, which I think is very important, because as leaders, we have to make sure that we are the lead and we are exuding the behaviors to set the example. So I want to walk you through this process that's highlighted on the catalyst.org that talks about how unconscious bias can lead to discrimination. I think this is very powerful. So the first area it highlights is a stereotype. A stereotype is a widely held, preconceived, and oversimplified image or idea about a person, a group, or a thing. And over time, that stereotype can become unconscious bias. It might be something that eventually evolves into unconscious bias. And again, unconscious bias is something that we don't even think about. It's just like, have you ever been riding in a car and then you ended up at work or at your destination and you're like, how did I get here? It's like your body is on autopilot. So that's how you think about it. Sometimes stereotypes can have you on autopilot, that you start to function in a way and you don't even realize that your bias is affecting how you see a group of people or individual. So again, unconscious bias is an automatic association or attitude about a race or gender. And then it's something that, operates beyond our control or awareness. And the example is race and gender. But again, that automatic association or attitude can apply to a lot of different things. And this is something that can influence our decision making and behavior toward the target of the bias, is a powerful predictor of our behavior. So our unconscious bias ends up showing out in our behaviors, which can lead to discrimination. So as leaders, we have to check ourselves, because we might not even realize we have these biases that might have been embedded through these stereotypes that we might be seeing on TV, or maybe it's things that we heard, and now it's affecting how we utilize or how we show up with that individual or with that team because of these stereotypes. So that's how we can evolve. So now that unconscious bias turns into prejudging, an attitude about a person or a group of people that is based on a belief or stereotype. So you see how it's evolving. That stereotype leads to unconscious bias, and now that prejudgment is happening towards that person or that group because of those different things that happened prior with the stereotype and unconscious bias. And now it starts to affect the behaviors. Based on preconceptions and unchecked assumptions, this can create in-groups and out-groups by favoring one group over the other. And yes, this can also apply outside of the racial aspect. This could be something that you might favor. Hey, I'm going to hire more males and females. Hey, I'm going to hire people that look like me versus people who don't look like me, or people from this background versus people from this other background. So you see how now this affects your behaviors, which can ultimately lead to discrimination, which is an action that follows an action that follows prejudicial attitudes, denial of opportunity, or unequal treatment regarding selection, promotion, etc. So you see as leaders how this bias, how this prejudging, how these behaviors that all started off with a stereotype can lead into discrimination that you might not even realize unconsciously that you're doing. You're moving on a regular basis, not even realize that you have that. So it's so important that awareness is something that we tap into as leaders, because I think as leaders, we need to be aware of ourselves first. That's why I talk about being that leadership development, understanding who you are, understanding your leadership style and how that impacts your organization, your business, how that impacts the people you support. Awareness is, again, identify the unconscious bias before it evolves to discrimination. Identify those stereotypes, all those different things. And that's why it's so important that you get to know your people, because again, that allows you to maybe those stereotypes that you might have heard on TV, or you might have heard in the household, or wherever you identify or connected with that stereotype. Now those walls are coming down, because now you are working around, or you're allowing yourself to get to know people that might not look like you, might not have the same background, maybe people of different sex. All those different things are so important that you're making sure that you're connecting to on a regular basis. So really make sure that as leaders, we are identifying and we're paying attention to the biases we might have, our stereotypes, so we can check it before it leads to discriminatory behavior. All right. So now the next area we're going to focus on is developing empathy. Empathy is so important. There was a 2018 State of Workplace Empathy study that happened. And what it identified as the participants is 96% of the employees surveyed believe that it is important. It's so important that you have that level of empathy. So what is empathy? It's understanding the feelings and emotions of other people. And I think this is highly important, because leaders need to understand that you might not be connected to what's going on. You might not even understand it. But the portion of empathy that's so powerful is that understanding. This is hey, I understand what you're dealing with. I'm open to listen. And again, that's so important as leaders, because we are connected to these people in some kind of way. They're going back to people that are going and marching, people who are going out and saying, we're not having this, people that are posting. These are people that work for you. These are people that are team members of yours. So now they're going to go back to this workplace, and you need to have a level of empathy just to have that understanding, even if you can't specifically relate to an incident or experience. As a West African, my experience is different than most Black Americans, because I grew up with a different mindset, or I grew up, not hearing necessarily about slavery. I didn't hear about that until I came to the United States. I always share people about that experience, about how I wasn't introduced to that, where typically Black Americans, they grow up, or they are, that's something that they hear about within as they progress in different school ages. So that was something different for me. So even as someone that might have the same skin tone as someone, I have a different experience, a different view, because I come from another country. So it's the same thing. If you're a male or a female, males have different experiences that might be different from females. And because of that, what they see and what they connect to is different. But that's why empathy is so important, so you can have that understanding. But how do you develop it? Build those relationships. Again, remember what we talked about last time, those stereotypes. A lot of stereotypes can be be dispelled by you getting to know someone, by you connecting with someone that might not look like you or doesn't have the same background as you. That's why it's so powerful when you get into workspaces where you might not be around, maybe in the area you live in, you might not be around people of different cultures, but now at work, you get to be around a plethora of cultures, backgrounds, demographics. And now by building relationships with them and understanding them, now you can really build up that empathy. So even as leaders, if we're leading our teams, do you know your team members? Have you gotten time to get to know that single mom or that single father? Have you gotten to know that person that works in the back that never comes out in the office, or that person that's so energetic and always communicating with everyone and just not speaking to them only? Are you building those connections so you can have that level of understanding or that rapport ahead of time? The next thing you want to consider is listen to understand, even if you can't relate, even if you can't relate to what they're dealing with, even though you can't relate to maybe the neighborhood they grew up in or how they're affected by it. Listen to understand, ask questions, and I know there's a level of conversation that you want to have because of the level of professionalism or the space you're in. But listen, ask questions and get with HR if you have an HR department to say, hey, what can we talk about? Is it okay that we have that conversation? Or bring in someone that's going to talk about diversity, inclusion, equity, so they can have that open dialogue in that training, because you're getting training to understand, just like you're getting training here. And you're also have an open dialogue within your organization, within your business. And again, if you're a business owner, you might have never thought about these things, but what are you doing as a business owner to create and really build those relationships, even though you can't relate maybe to your team members? And last thing, ask how you can support within limits of professionalism, within limits of HR, because it might be, hey, I need you to support me. Hey, I need to take a day off today because I'm really emotional about what's going on, and understanding that people are affected by this. So again, leaders, make sure that developing empathy is something that's a part of the process of developing those leadership skills in these situations that we're dealing with today. All right, so now let's talk about team culture and organizational culture. This is so important. We can really impact change within our teams because as leaders, we have direct contact to our team. But now our behaviors can really affect the organization. So as a team culture, as leaders who might only be able to touch their team, maybe you have a 5-person team, a 6-person team, or you might be the CEO. You might be listening. You're like, I am the organization. I'm the one that can really affect change from the top. These are things that's going to really benefit you. But if you're someone that can affect change solely to your team, be aware of the policies, the procedures, the code of ethics. I know we have training every year or maybe something in relation to diversity, but this is a perfect time for you to really get with your HR department, get with your team and find out what are the code of ethics, what are the policies, so I'm aware of it during the season. Set and reiterate standards and expectations, especially in regards to this. You want to make sure you set those standards, you reiterate them. And again, when you're having these training sessions or these conversations, this is a great time to have that conversation. Embed that in that process when you're doing the one-on-one sessions with your team members, so you can have the conversation about team culture and the importance of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Model the behaviors. Remember, I said as leaders, we have to be able to model these behaviors. We are the lead. We're the ones that have to set the standard. So if we aren't being people that have an understanding or having an empathy, if we're not the ones that are open to diversity, inclusion, and equity, it's going to show. So we have to make sure we are showing up and we're not just telling people, we're also doing it as well. Reinforce accountability. If somebody does something wrong, how are you addressing it? Remember, only 15% of those cases are relieved. But within your business and your organization, within your team, how are you holding people accountable? How are you making sure people are holding themselves accountable? And again, that should be embedded in your policies and procedures. Address the elephant in the room. If you can have that open dialogue, the great thing about small business owners, they can have this open dialogue. So have those conversations, address the elephant in the room, and have those conversations about this. So you're ensuring your team culture is great. And then last thing is organizational culture. If you are at the top and you can really make those high level decisions, host a leadership development session. Make sure your leaders are available and they're aware of this information and they know what to do. You might need to do an emergency meeting this week. Monday, call them all in. We need to have an emergency meeting. I need to make sure you guys know conflict resolution. I need to make sure you guys understand diversity and making sure that you are modeling that behavior. And now they can go out and be effective leaders. The next thing is making sure you're doing that diversity training, that inclusion training, that equity training. And again, this is a great time to do it. Sometimes sometimes in emergency situations, you might have to repeat some training. So this is a great time to do that. So host a session, reach out to somebody, say, hey, I want to hire and bring somebody on so we can have these conversations, so we can have that open dialogue. And maybe within that conversation, leaders can build relationships with their team members. They can get an understanding of their background and understand and build that empathy that's so important, and get human resources the guidance. Find out what the rules and regulations are, because they have a lot of that information. Again, that code of conduct and ethics. As a business owner, even myself, as I'm building a team, this wasn't things that I was thinking about before. But even as a small business owner that doesn't have a huge organization with an HR department, have you created a code of conduct, a code of ethics that you ensure that's embedded in your mission and vision statement? And you have that, hey, I have my mission statement, I have my vision statement, and I have my code of conduct and ethics. So even as a business owner, you are setting the standard that we are about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And finally, your disciplinary process that needs to be thought of as well, business owners. Think about that. Again, these big organizations, corporate, they have these things, but have you considered what laws are in place? How do I make sure I'm not violating any rules? Make sure that if I do find out that one of my team members on the outside is engaging in racial, discrimination, I can handle it, and I know how to handle it that's effective. And it's, again, if it's in your code of conduct and ethics and you're already setting that standard, then again, you have that disciplinary process already there, and now you're just executing on there. Because unfortunately, the reality is you might have to you might have to engage in disciplinary action against someone. That is the reality of the climate that we're in. That might have to happen. So already have those processes in place ahead of time so you can address it. So please know that team culture can affect change into the organization as well. So leaders, even if you're at the first or mid-tier, just know that whatever your team is doing could also affect change. Whatever conversations your team is having could affect another team and another team. And now the organization is considering how to embed this process within what they're doing. So I hope that really helps. Again, we're in a time that's very sensitive. We're at a time where people are really hurting everywhere. So as leaders, we really have to step up and have that open door policy, be empathic, be understanding, and support those that really need your support in this season. So please replay this, share this to another leader. Make sure you utilize these tools. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach me at aishathomas.org. These are my different platforms. I will have this on YouTube on replay for you to watch, and you can follow me on all social media platforms. And remember, team members don't quit the organization, they quit the leader. They will quit that leader that is practicing discriminatory behavior. They'll quit that leader that's not embedding equity. They'll quit that leader that's not making sure diversity and inclusion is in there. So as leaders, we are the face of our organization. We are the face of our businesses. So make sure we become those trend-setting leaders and embed inclusion, diversity, and equity in everything that we do.